This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's a pleasure to welcome everybody back. And we have a very interesting program today. We're going to be talking about several governance type issues, not the least of which is the increased focus on compensation committees. And I have a terrific guest that's joining me today. I'd like to introduce Arnold, who is a board member on multiple companies. Just let me give a quick rundown of some of the ones that you're a board member on. Carnival, Crow Holdings, Oil Dry of America, and Laclede Group. So, and I know that you're the comp chair on at least two of those. So welcome to the show, Arnold.
Thank you, TK. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I thought the first thing that we do, since you have had the chance to be a board member for 10 plus years, is I think it's a good place to start is just give us a little introspective look at your opinion on what's changed over that period from when you first joined the board to sort of what the environment is today, which we obviously know is much more transparent.
Yeah, it is, and that is the change. I think any director you would talk to that served on a board for over 10 years would probably echo what I'm about to say, which is that the level of transparency is certainly much higher in what goes on in the boardroom than it was, say, more than 10 years ago. And that's evolved. Sarbanes-Oxley had a lot to do with that, and to start out with audit committees. And we all know how intense the audit committees became. And now it's moved over into compensation committees with CDNAs. And if you happen to be, like I am on one of the boards I'm on, we're dual listed in the UK remuneration reports. And is moving on to nominating and governance next. And so, the level of disclosure, the level of scrutiny, the level of transparency has increased dramatically. And then I think one positive outcome of that has been the level of self-assessments of boards. I think the level of self-assessment, the rigor that is done, the attention that's paid to it by the individual directors is at a higher level than it was, say, maybe more than 10 years ago.
When you first joined the boards, did you ever think that the comp committee would have more focus and what's seemingly more responsibility than the audit committee? Did you ever think that day would come?
I absolutely did not think that there would be the level of detail and scrutiny and reporting requirements for compensation that there was even 10 years ago for audit, let alone what audit evolved into. And now, comp committees are certainly at that level.
Well, let's use that as sort of a segue into the next question that I want to ask you, knowing that, again, you've served as chair of the comp committee, so you've been in the direct firing line, if you will, from that. But my question is more general. I want you to sort of say, we know that there's been tremendous evolution, and there has to be talent on the comp committee these days with all that you have to go through. But in today's world, what do you think are like some of the main keys that our viewers would, it might be helpful to our viewers to make sure that a compensation committee is effective in today's times?
Well, I think the first thing every director, whether on the comp committee or not, just needs to keep in the forefront is, what is the purpose of compensation in a corporation? And it's to attract, retain, develop, and motivate, the talent that's needed to create shareholder value. I mean, that's the purpose of compensation. And within that context, my personal bias is to always let that be the driver of all of our decisions, since we really are stewarding the shareholders' assets, and it's our responsibility from a governance standpoint to ensure that shareholder value is created. And so with regards to compensation, I often encourage my fellow committee members and the board at large to look at competitive pay, the various market comparisons, as a guide, not as a rule. And as a guide, we look at them after we've determined compensation to see, are we an outlier? Are we on the low end? Or are we on the high end? If we're in the range, then discussion ended. If we're on the low end, why? Is there a reason for that? If we're on the high end, why? Is there a reason for that? And so we don't want to be tied to market comparisons. We want to use them as a useful tool to help ensure that we are in fact attracting, retaining, developing, and motivating the right talent to drive shareholder value.
Well, it's a great point. That's an excellent point. And no comp committee, you don't get much heat externally when you're low,
right,
okay?
Right.
You get that from the inside, and then it reverses itself if you're high,
Exactly.
So, but anyway, corporate board members sort of labeled this year the year of shareholder communications, and that's because when we've seen this transparency, this has translated now into votes. There's more shareholder proposals, we've got say on pay, so all of a sudden the need to communicate with the shareholder has been heightened. Because of the financial crisis, we've also seen more disclosures happening. My question to you is simple. These things have been initiated, and people are proposing more and more. They say on pay is so successful that they now are thinking about say on other things where the shareholders are involved. Does it concern you at all that there is a limit to this disclosure and this communication to where we almost could get to the point that some of our best and most qualified potential directors may not want to serve, or the current board is so distracted with all these issues that you don't get back to the strategy?
Well, you said it was a simple question, but it's a complex response. So, let's just start with, first of all, the increased disclosure and transparency and what the ramifications of that is. I think in the end, whether it was 10 years ago or today, boards have a responsibility to steward the assets and to do everything within their purview and from a governance standpoint to accelerate creation of shareholder value. That's the task, okay? And in that regard, where transparency contributes to that, it's a good thing. Where transparency and additional disclosures interfere with that, it's not a good thing. And you have some of both of that, okay? Because often, say some of the CDNAs, they have gotten pretty complicated. And for the investor, I'm not as certain what clarity is provided or what meaningful new information is provided. But it does incur cost to generate the information. It takes time, so cost in terms of management time, et cetera. And so while I think the general direction of openness is very good and appropriate, that some of the actual specific execution can work the opposite. Some of the unintended outcomes can be difficult. And to your question about does it drive board members to reconsider whether they will continue on the board, and if you take it beyond comp to audit and to nominating and governance, I think in general there is a perceived perception of greater reputational risk, amongst directors with some of the more recent, actions around disclosure and some of the more recent actions around shareholder rights. I think directionally, of course, it's a good thing. I mean, it's the shareholders own the company, and they absolutely should have the rights. Okay, but what you don't want to do is you don't want the board to do this to the CEO, and you don't want shareholder watch groups to do it to the board, where every little decision, every little operating thing is looked at in isolation and potentially challenged. And if the pendulum swings too far that way, then absolutely you'll have gifted people who could really serve shareholders well elect not to participate on a publicly traded company board. To say it is at that point, I'm sure for some individuals it is, but generally speaking, I don't think so. I think it is a watch out going forward.
Yeah, we can only hope that the SEC sort of stays on top of the proxy, because if it ends up being a 150-page document, you know, there's no way that that helps the individual shareholder. And
Exactly.
the fear there is single interest groups, you know, everybody adding one thing, the next thing you know, the collective, you know, proxy ends up being, you know, way too confusing, way too complicated. So hopefully they'll have insight into what disclosures are working, what gets to the point of protecting the investor and doesn't hurt the shareholder ultimately, because even the SEC ultimately wants that shareholder value.
I think everybody wants the same thing, and you know, you take something as simple as a concept like pay for performance. You know, you have to look at performance over time. You have to look at the individual things that occur in a given year. You have to look at that individual's, you know, personal situation. And whenever it moves to the point of kind of commonality where here are the rules, you have to have this composition of equity versus, you know, fixed pay. You have to have this type of timeline in which you're measuring over. Whenever it moves to that direction, you are actually interfering with the most powerful tool of all, which is the creativity to drive the behaviors that you want to create the shareholder value. And I think we're not there yet. That's not happened. There are some tendencies, there are some watch outs, but I think you could pick any subject, whether it's, you know, in the fiscal responsibility area, the organizational behavior, you know, area, the nominating governance area, and we just have to be smart about it and continue to dialogue and make sure we're doing both. We're getting the shareholders what they need, and we're giving the boards and the management of the firms the freedom to create the shareholder value.
Arnold, we have about a minute left, but I want to make sure, we always try and ask our guests this question, and maybe you can give us the short answer for this. When you look ahead in the future, what worries you about the future in the boardroom? And then on the counter side, what encourages you of that? If you just take a look at the boardroom as you see going forward, what encourages you and what discourages you?
Well, 66% of the U.S. population is women and minorities. So for U.S.-based corporations, one of the things that concerns me looking forward is the regression in the degree of diversity on many corporate boards. And I see it also as a great opportunity. And when I say diversity, I mean diversity of thinking, gender, ethnic diversity, but diversity of very competent and capable people organized around creating shareholder value for that particular firm. And I see that the facts state that since 2004, the number of African Americans on the Fortune 500 corporate boards has actually declined, that the number of women and Asians and Hispanics plus African Americans is overall directionally flat. And all those groups were underrepresented in 2004. So when you look at that and you look at the changing dynamics on a global basis as well as domestically here in the U.S., you know, that's a concern. We have to have all the best thinking at the table to steward and accelerate the shareholder value. And as I look forward to what looks better, I think some of the transparency and the disclosure has definitely enhanced the critical self-assessment, and I think directors are taking even greater responsibility for ensuring that they are doing what they should do. And I'm optimistic that that will include ensuring that there is diversity of thinking. Everyone has a seat at the table on the board to help create shareholder value.
Arnold Donald, thank you for joining us today.
TK, thank you.
And audience, I hope you found that helpful. And we hope that you'll join us again next week when we'll take another look at an important topic that'll help you be a better board member and a better committee member. And we will see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.